Hello and welcome to the Action Network podcast. I am Sean Zerillo, joined today by Eric Raskin and Brian Fonseca to break down the boxing match between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Bud Crawford going down this Saturday night at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. The card starts at 8 p.m. I'm sure walkouts for this main event will be closer to 11 p.m. or midnight Eastern. For the undisputed welterweight titles, Crawford 39-0, 30 knockouts, Spence 28-0. 22 knockouts. Very exciting fight in the boxing realm. Obviously, a big UFC card going on this Saturday night as well. But we're going to turn our attention to this very important welterweight tilt. And Eric Raskin, Brian, I want to get both of your reactions first. When you saw this line come out, because, you know, as somebody who handicaps another combat sport, sometimes I like to see the line before I've done any work. Sometimes I like to do all the work and then see the line. So, Eric, I want to hear from you first. Did you have an idea of who you were picking before you saw the line? Did you see the line and have a reaction of, oh, this might be a little bit off? What, you know, how did you come to finding the betting odds for this match, you know, relative to when you knew about its booking?
So this was a rare fight where the betting line was available before the fight was signed. They do that on occasion with the big fights that they think are probably coming. And so this is one where probably a month or so before this fight was made official, I saw FanDuel had it minus 112 both ways, which is basically unheard of in boxing. We get so used to the minus 1400 guy versus the plus 800 guy that to see a minus 112 each way, it just doesn't happen very often. So that's where it opened before the fight was signed. I liked Crawford all along. I liked him at that price. I didn't realize the odds would then proceed to move as much as they have. As we're having this conversation, I'm seeing him anywhere from minus 146 all the way up to minus 190, and that is probably more where this fight belongs than the minus 112 both ways where it started. So yeah, I think there was definitely value on Crawford when the lines first went up.
Yeah, Crawford currently sitting, as you said, around minus 150 consensus right now. That's about 60% in terms of an implied probability. Spence plus 120 on the comeback. The fight also minus 210 to go to a decision. That is 67% implied. As I said, both fighters undefeated, but both have a healthy number of knockouts on their record. Brian, same question to you. Just your reaction, you know, like Eric had when you first saw the line. Did you see it when it was a pick'em price and go, wow, that should certainly be tilted more towards one direction? Or did you come around to seeing the odds closer to where it is at the current line?
I felt like when this first went up, and it was actually earlier, like months before, maybe even a year or so before, because this has been talked about, again, boxing being boxing, this fight has been talked about for about 5 years at this point, since they first confronted each other in a dingy hallway after a Maurice Hooker Alex Saucedo fight in late 2018. And this has sort of been a rumored bout for a long time. COVID came and happened, and, you know, we knew we weren't going to get it for the time being. But as far as the line, yeah, it was minus 112, minus 113 both ways. But I don't recall seeing Errol Spence a favorite at all at any point. It was even, and I felt like it would move a little bit towards Terrence Crawford because for reasons, you know, we're going to get to, it seemed like Terrence Crawford being the narrow favorite was how this was going to lean, even though I personally have spoken to a bunch of people, not fight people necessarily, but fight fans who are just favoring Errol Spence for different reasons that we're going to get into. But the line wasn't totally shocking at all. And for me, I just think that with betting on this, the money line is actually something you could look at, which isn't the case for a lot of boxing matches, because a lot of times, like Eric said, you got a minus 1,400 favorite. At the morning we're recording this, Naoya Inoue was a minus 400 favorite. And, you know, usually the favorite does win, not all the time. But this time you could actually look at the money line and get some decent value.
Before we talk about the specific technical aspects of the fight, the way that they match up specifically, I want to go into each fighter individually and just kind of have you describe their archetype, right? You know, are they a counter puncher? Are they a pressure fighter? You know, give me, because styles make fights, certainly, and the stylistic matchups is going to determine what occurs. But in terms of how these fighters individually have taken on their competition leading into this fight, and then also who amongst them you think has had the more difficult strength of schedule. So, Eric, just going to throw it back to you first. If you could just give me a general archetype for each of the fighters, and then also who you think has had the more difficult path to getting to this bout.
Sure. Spence is probably the easier one to describe in that he's a little more something we've seen before. He is a southpaw, which that alone makes him unique, but he fights in a pretty standard stand-up style, boxing behind the jab, a very busy jab. He's pretty predictable, frankly, from the outside. From the inside, a little less so, but from the outside, he's mostly 1-2s and using his length and strength. He's a 2012 U.S. Olympian. He has that amateur background, and you can see it in just his basic stylistic approach. Crawford is a little harder to describe and a little more unique. He's a switch hitter. He almost always comes out in the orthodox stance, but does his best work from the southpaw stance and just kind of bides his time and waits to switch to southpaw, waits to really get going. He'll often fall behind a few rounds in a fight. He is a counter puncher. He isn't that good of an inside fighter, even though Spence is longer and stronger. He's probably got the advantage inside, but from distance, Bud can just do so many more things. He can throw such a variety of punches and catch you from angles that you don't see coming and mix it up more. So that's kind of how I handicap the styles. One is more predictable and one is less predictable. I would say over the breadth of his career, going from lightweight to junior welterweight to now welterweight, Crawford has greater accomplishments, has fought a pretty wide range of top quality opposition. But strictly at welterweight, Spence has the better track record. He's beaten more guys in this division. He's been in this division his whole pro career. Best wins, close decision over Sean Porter, a breakthrough win over Kell Brook several years ago. His most recent victory 15 months ago against Yordenis Ugas was a real eye-opener. He's got the better welterweight track record. Bud Crawford, I'd say his only really meaningful win at 147 pounds was his knockout of Sean Porter. That's maybe the best win on his record, period. But he's spanned 3 divisions. Spence has been a career-long welterweight.
Brian, I saw you nodding your head. Would you generally agree with that assessment? And also, how do you view the size in this matchup? Because Bud does have a 2-inch reach advantage. He's an inch shorter. As Eric said, he's moved up through multiple weight classes. Typically, I would favor the fighter on power who has been staying at the same weight class their whole career. But to my knowledge, and based on the betting odds, Bud's knockout odds and his chances of getting a knockout seem higher. So does the fact that he's moved up through multiple weight classes sort of built himself up into being a true welterweight, change your analysis at any point? And do you agree in terms of the fact that Spence has had the more difficult schedule as a welterweight?
There are certain guys where they move up in weight and actually get stronger. The lack of cutting weight is actually favorable to them. And Terence Crawford is 9-0 at welterweight, all wins by knockout, every single one of them. And with Terence Crawford, he also is just more versatile than Errol Spence. Errol Spence, you know how he's going to win this fight if you think he's going to win this fight. He's going to come forward, he's going to break you down, and it's not going to be an absurd level of creativity. It could be on the inside offensively because Errol Spence is one of the most dynamic body punchers that there is in the sport. And that particularly will be one of the keys to victory for him. Terence Crawford can beat you in more ways. He's a better counterpuncher. He's a better defensive fighter. He can switch orthodox and southpaw, give you different looks. He's actually better at switching stances than anyone in boxing right now. And because of that versatility, people also forget that he could fight on the inside a little bit. He shouldn't against Errol Spence, but he could fight on the inside a little bit. He also has a reach advantage, as you mentioned, Sean, 2 inches, despite being the shorter fighter, which is advantageous to him because if he's going to beat Errol Spence, he cannot be on the inside of this fight. Errol Spence, in terms of walking you down, hunting you from the inside, banging on the inside, body punching, head hunting a little bit, but mostly going downstairs, upstairs, and mixing up his offense. He's as good as anybody at doing that. And with Terence Crawford, he doesn't have the resume I think that Errol Spence does, but the rounds are not close, and he doesn't lose rounds. Kind of like Khabib Nurmagomedov in the UFC. He's not a guy that loses rounds. Errol Spence had a split decision victory over Sean Porter. Terence Crawford fought him a year and a half or so after, however long that was, and knocked him out. He was the only person to knock out Sean Porter, who was a very high-level welterweight, fought Keith Thurman, fought Danny Garcia, fought pretty much everybody, Adrian Broner, when Adrian Broner was still good. And with Terence Crawford, he just has wiped out pretty much everyone he's fought. He's beaten a couple undefeated champions like Julius Ndongo and Victor Postol, who were never the same again after fighting Terrence Crawford. That's pretty indicative to me. And with Errol Spence, I think that he's fought better competition overall, but Terrence Crawford has just looked better in some of these victories. We even saw Spence struggle a little bit, a couple different points against Yordenis Ugas, who's a strong, contender at welterweight, but I think that Terrence Crawford will probably beat him a little more soundly than Errol Spence did.
I'll dispute one thing that you said there, Brian, of Terrence Crawford doesn't lose rounds. He does, although it's usually by choice. But he has had a lot of fights in his career where he kind of will just about give away the first 3 or 4 rounds before he really gets revved up. Usually, again, before he switches southpaw. But you are in good company on one observation you made there, that he's the best at switching stances in the sport. I just saw Freddie Roach said the exact same thing. So so you're thinking along the same lines as Freddie Roach. That's a good sign.
Yeah, very good sign.
And you guys make an interesting point about Crawford potentially giving up minutes early, the Floyd Mayweather strategy, getting reads on the opponent and then building into the fight. Do you think that makes, Eric, just going to go right to you, and then Brian, you jump in after. Do you think that makes him a good live betting target after the first few rounds? Is that typically how you would look to bet a Bud Crawford fight, Eric?
Yep, I'm thinking exactly what you're thinking. This was the sort of the closing comment in the article that I wrote previewing the fight on Sports Handle, was that if you missed the minus 112 opportunity on Bud and you're not as likely to want to bet him at minus 150, wait a few rounds into the fight and see if he does what he's done so many times, which is fall behind, maybe 3 rounds to 1 or something. If the odds makers don't really factor in his tendencies, and the fact that he's behind by a few rounds may not mean anything, if they think it means something and you start seeing plus money next to Terrence Crawford's name, that's a perfect bet to jump on. This is one where you want to have your apps open as you're watching this fight.
Same approach for you, Brian?
I would totally agree with that, because with Terrence Crawford, he is literally one of these guys when they say downloading information, that's what he does for the first, we'll call it 2, maybe 3 rounds. He doesn't typically want to give up 3 rounds in a fight, but he's done that before and then come back, turn the tide or whatever. And even sometimes as he's waiting, figuring you out in those first couple of rounds before he kicks it into gear, sometimes he still blows you away and is able to counter effectively, figure you out a little bit sooner. He did that to Julius Ndongo and then knocked him down in the second round, knocked him out in the third round. Some guys are just easier to figure out, I suppose. And with Errol Spence, it's not really for me whether or not Terrence Crawford is going to figure him out, because I think he is. But just because you can figure him out doesn't mean you could withstand the power. If he could withstand the power, then that's really what we should be talking about in terms of whether or not he's going to win this fight. Because I think Errol Spence is going to find him, probably not as much as he would like, because Errol Spence finds everybody. But Terrence Crawford has a chin. He's taken some punches before. He hasn't been dropped. Some people think that Mean Machine might have gotten him a few years ago, but he wasn't dropped in his career, hasn't been yet. Errol Spence neither. And that's sort of the interesting thing about this fight too, is that we haven't seen any guy, while we've seen them overcome adversity, they haven't had to go to that place yet. And the feeling is that either one of them can take them there.
Let's talk about how either fighter can win this fight and look at the winning method market. So Crawford sitting around plus 165 to win by decision. Spence around plus 200. Knockout, Crawford plus 260. Spence plus 575. Now, in terms of their actual betting odds and then breaking that down into percentages of winning methods, the betting market is telling you that if Bud is going to win about 60% of the time by decision, 40% by knockout. For Spence, it's actually a split of 80% by decision and 20% by knockout. And based on how you guys were talking about this fight, it seemed to me, with Crawford potentially being the better minute winner, especially down the stretch, that the knockout odds for Spence might just be a tad undervalued, because it seemed to me, based on how you guys were talking about the fight, if Spence wins, it's probably likelier that he wins by knockout. So Eric, just want to throw it to you to talk about the winning methods, how you see either fighter winning, and whether you think those percentage chances, again, just to reiterate, about 60-40 is the split for Crawford, decision versus knockout, 80-20 for Spence, decision versus knockout. Do you think those percentages are off?
No, they're actually pretty accurate, I would say. I'm not seeing like huge value jumping out at me on any of those particular prices and markets. I did, by shopping around, I did see Crawford by decision as high as plus 200 at one book. And so if you can find that, if you have access to that in your state, I think maybe there's some value there, because that is my ultimate pick in the fight, even though, look, it's a really hard fight to pick. Again, it opened at minus 112 each way. This is an unusual fight in that regard, that there is no real obvious favorite. But if I had to pick something, it would be Crawford by decision. The price you said plus 165, I'm not sure if there's value at plus 200. I think there probably is. Yeah, they're making it kind of tempting to try to go against the grain and pick one of these guys by knockout, especially Spence. I guess what Brian pointed out about Spence's body work, that's key. If you're picking a Spence knockout, which is the longest shot of those four for good reason, I guess you're banking on that maybe he can hurt Crawford to the body. Again, I forget exactly what you said the odds on Spence by knockout were. Was that something like
575 or plus 600?
Yeah. That's worth maybe a small bet, a flyer on the chance that it could happen, that just his basic size and strength really comes to the fore here. It's not the outcome I'm predicting, but at plus 575, maybe it's worth thinking about. But still, out of these various method of victory markets, I think the best one is still Crawford by decision.
Brian, just to reiterate, so about 60-40 is the split, the expected split for Crawford decision versus knockout, 80-20 for Spence decision versus knockout. Do you disagree with those percentages at all? And I know you're also leaning, I believe, to Crawford by decision.
Yeah, I'm taking Crawford by decision as my main pick for this fight. It won't be my only bet, because I'll look at some other things to bet. And I'll probably wait after the first couple rounds, see if I can get Terrence Crawford live, for that extra value. But in terms of Terrence Crawford by decision, I got it at plus 175. And you could find it maybe as high as 200 if you're lucky. And you could probably find it as high as 200 if you wait a couple rounds to bet it live, right? That's something that may happen too. But if Errol Spence is going to win this fight, I think he could win on the cards if it's close enough. I actually could see this, and there's going to be some added value here. Bet on a split decision, bet on a majority decision. This fight could be really close either way. Like, if you think Crawford's going to win, like, I think the majority decision or split decision sprinkle is going to be worth it. I don't see that available yet. That probably should be available maybe by the time this is out, maybe by the time that the fight comes around. And sometimes you can get those numbers in the high, like almost plus 1,000, probably plus 500, 600, 800, or whatever the case may be. Like, there's some good value there. And I think this could be potentially really close. Like, what I'm predicting is similar to Devin Haney versus Vasily Lomachenko, although hopefully without controversy. But I think that the scorecards 115, 113, 116, 112 we're going to be in the range of that kind of a close fight. And if we are, then majority decision, split decision, all you need is like for the scorecards to be close. Maybe one breaks the other way, and then you could add some value there on your bet. Majority decision, you need, for people who don't know, you need a draw from one judge and 2 for the winner. So you would be banking on somebody to score at 114, and then the winner would get, the 2 cards in their favor. Split decision would be 2 one way, 1 the other. And I think those are some of the things you could look at. But ultimately, I think that if Terrence Crawford wins this fight, and I think he will, it will likely be by decision. So that's about plus 175 when I got it. I think Errol Spence is the likelier candidate to win by knockout, but we also have to remember, and this is something to factor in if you're doing like long shot knockout bets, Terrence Crawford could expose sort of the eye injury that Errol Spence has had in the past. Injuries are a factor in this too. And, fights could stop because of freak things like that. This is why boxing on betting is hard, even though sometimes it could seem predictable. So I think that that's one thing to keep track of too. So I think the knockout bets, while they're fun and I don't think they're going to happen, they could be worth a sprinkle just because anything can happen in this sport, even as predictable as it may seem sometimes.
I love where your head is at, Brian, with the majority decision and the split decision and all that, because I was looking at that as well. And there was one book that did have some of that stuff up. And I think you're really going to like the prices there a little higher than what you were guessing. I saw Crawford majority decision at plus 1400.
Oh, give me that.
Spence majority decision plus 1600, or you can take a little less risk on it and go either guy by majority decision at plus 750. So then you need that 114 to 114 scorecard to make it work. But I agree with you. This is the kind of fight that could be close, could be tough to score. Even if it isn't that tough to score, and the whole world seems to agree that one guy clearly won it, you still sometimes get one judge who's an outlier giving you a scorecard that doesn't make sense. So those are some fun kind of long shot approaches on this one.
Well, it's still boxing, so you still have, pre-filled scorecards where one scorecard is for one fighter before the fight, one for the other fighter before the fight, and there's only actually one judge judging the fight in front of them. So both guys leaning towards Bud by decision, but the split or majority decision props plus 750 for either fighter. Would you say plus 1400 for Bud, Eric? Yeah, that sounds very interesting to me as well. In addition to probably the best way to play it, which is Bud Crawford live after rounds 3, round 4, round 5, somewhere in there after potentially starting slow and giving away early minutes. Guys, before we move on to potential undercard bets for Saturday, any other thoughts on this fight? Any other ways you're thinking about betting it? Brian, I'm going to go back to you.
I think if Terence Crawford, one, he wins this fight, he's pound for pound number 1, right? So him and Naoya in a way could fight.
Right, I was going to say, Naoya in a way made that very complicated. But
yeah, it made that very complicated. But I think that's what this sort of fight signifies. And the fun thing about it is there is a rematch clause. So we may see this again. I don't know if it'll be at welterweight, but we may see this fight again if it does happen. But in terms of betting on it, I would tell people I wouldn't go crazy with the just sort of fun knockdown props that'll be like plus 2,000 and both fighters to be knocked down and Terence Crawford to be knocked down in rounds 1, 2, or 3. And I'm not saying that those definitely aren't going to happen, part of the double negative, but I don't think this is a fight where you can sprinkle on a ton of long shots. I think the long shots you should be looking at though are your fighter of choice, because look, if Errol Spence could win this fight too. We should acknowledge that also. I don't want to be dismissive to that. He could win by knockout or by points or by decision. And I think that whoever you're backing to win, look at split decision, look at majority decision, those type of long shots. I think you can get good, realistic value on. I wouldn't put a ton of money on it, but I would look at those things and definitely live bet. Look at the fight as it's happening. Terence Crawford after 2 rounds is something I would look at live. If Errol Spence is kicking it into another gear, round 6, 7, 8, and you feel like he's breaking down Terence Crawford and really hitting him to the body and turning the tide in his favor, try to, as Eric said, keep your app open if you're watching this fight live, because the money line is probably, unless there's obviously a knockdown or just a lot of momentum going one way or the other, the money line is going to be pretty favorable. It's going to be pretty close throughout the fight, as long as the fight plays out the way it should in terms of it being a tight fight. So split decisions, majority decisions, things of that nature, I would definitely look at more than I'd look at the more fun stuff where it's both fighters to be knocked down in the first minute of round 11 and things of that nature, because I don't know if that's going to happen.
I mean, now in my mid-30s, if I'm not betting split or majority decision props on big-time boxing matches, I don't know what I'm doing, because I've been paying attention long enough to all the wonky split decisions we get in boxing. Eric, any final thoughts on Spence Crawford?
Yeah, there's one, this flies in the face of what Brian was just saying about not betting those stupid knockdown props, but there is one that I like that I think is fun, which is I saw any knockdown to be scored by either guy in any of the first 4 rounds was plus 1,600, which seemed a little bit of a high price for someone to just sneak in a flash knockdown anywhere in those first 4 rounds. That one kind of had my eye. And then the other thing that I noticed was a bet that has to be the worst boxing bet I've ever seen and the most painful sweat imaginable. I saw a price of minus 4,000 to bet under 1.5 knockdowns in this fight, which do I think there will probably be under 1.5 knockdowns? Yeah, probably. That's the right side. But risking $400 to win $10 and sweating every time a punch is thrown that, oh God, please don't anyone touch down. It just seems like the most horrendous sweat imaginable. I advise everyone to stay as far away as possible from that bet at that price.
I think you parlay the knockdown in the first 4 rounds with the under 1.5 knockdowns to the fight, and you go with the ultimate sweat and a completely unnecessary parlay. Let's talk about any undercard bets you guys might have for Saturday. Don't have to go super in-depth at all, just some potential action you might think people would want to have as they're watching the card in the lead up to Spence and Crawford. Eric, any undercard bets for you?
Yeah, the one fight that has my eye is the great veteran future Hall of Famer Nonito Donaire taking on Alexandra Santiago. And it's a pretty close fight on the odds board, minus 160-ish for Donaire, plus 130 I'm seeing for Santiago. And I kind of like Santiago. Donaire's 40 years old. Even at even money, Santiago was kind of the way I was leaning in this one. It just that potential for Donaire is coming off a 2-round knockout loss to the Great Noe in a way which doesn't necessarily tell you anything, but it was a brutal physical defeat that may have been his age starting to show through, and now another year has passed. He's gotten that much older. Santiago is the classic pain in the ass fighter. He doesn't really seem like he's all that good, but he's just effective. He's not super talented, but he's just in your grill, and it could be exactly the wrong kind of opponent for Donaire to face at this point. And this fight got delayed 2 weeks at the last minute. It was supposed to happen 2 weeks ago. They wanted to shuffle some fights around because of fighters falling out, so they moved this from another card onto this pay-per-view, presumably added a few bucks to each fighter's purse to convince them to stay in training camp an extra 2 weeks. But at age 40, to be ready to peak for a fight and then kind of hold off and maintain that peak for 2 more weeks and make weight, it all adds up to a pretty tough situation for Donaire. So I kind of like Santiago as a plus 130 underdog. And I also saw him by knockout at plus 550, which, again, a 40-year-old fighter who's been knocked out a couple of times, plus 550 on the underdog to stop Donaire is kind of intriguing to me.
Santiago's 27 years old. Is that correct? He's in his late 20s. Yeah, and, I talk about this all the time in the UFC podcast. I don't know what the stats are for boxing, but when there's at least an 8-year age gap between UFC fighters, especially when the fighter who's older is near 40 years old, the younger fighter actually wins 10%, or actually it's getting closer to 12% more often than the betting market tells you their fair odds are. So younger fighters, I think general, tend to be undervalued because the older fighter has the fan base, they have the name recognition, et cetera, but the durability usually shot at that point. So Santiago plus 130, a bet I'm going to be joining Eric on. Brian, any undercard bets that you like for Saturday?
Yeah, one, I like that one, even though Santiago, if you look him up, he has a maddening record. He's 27-3-5. He's 5 draws. And I think, but Donaire, yeah, I mean, coming back from a Naoya Inoue knockout in round 2 at that age, and I feel like I've been watching Nonito Donaire my whole life. He was in Fight Night Champion as a veteran, and that game came out 12 years ago. You know what I mean? So he's been around for a long time. Elsewhere on the undercard, I would look at Isaac Cruz, Giovanni Cabrera, which is a very fun fight for people who don't know or may not remember. Isaac Cruz fought Gervonta Davis very tough a couple of years ago in a fight that Davis won, but it was very close. I scored it 115, 113 personally. Davis was hurt in the fight, but Isaac Cruz, came forward and really made a fight out of it and nearly unseated, I guess, one of the best in this lightweight division. Isaac Cruz is fighting Giovanni Cabrera, who's 21-0, who has not been at this level of fight yet. Isaac Cruz is a big favorite, even though he has a couple losses, because he's that good. He's menacing. And I actually think that, and the books have him to win by knockout at minus 280. He's a big favorite. So obviously you're not doing that. I mean, decent parlay leg, right? One that you could trust. And I would say that if you're gonna play the Isaac Cruz knockout minus 280, do it in a parlay, because that's actually a pretty reliable leg. You could do that with like Team USA in the World Cup or something along those lines. And perhaps Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence, who you think is going to win that fight. There's your 3-legger right there. But I always look at alternative group round betting. Isaac Cruz to win. Knockout between rounds 1 through 6 is plus 170. I think that's a little bit undervalued, even though it's nearly even between 7 and 12, you have it at plus 125. I feel like it can go either way, but I think Isaac Cruz can get him out of there early. I really do. He has a second round knockout in his last fight against Eduardo Ramirez. That was on the undercard of Luis Ortiz and Andy Ruiz, I believe it was, last year. And Yuriorkis Gamboa knocked him out in the 5th round. And Yuriorkis Gamboa doesn't really have a chin anymore, so that wasn't that surprising. I would say Isaac Cruz to win. Group round betting between 1 and 6 is interesting. Between 5 and 8, you probably get a little bit more value, but I think he can get Cabrera out of there quickly, even though Cabrera will try to keep his distance, not really engage with Isaac Cruz. You watch him fight for a round and you'll know why. But I think that's something to look at too. Or you could just play the knockout straight up as a parlay leg.
And for the East Coast fight fans who don't like staying up late, you go ahead and bet that KO 1 through 6 and root for it to happen for multiple reasons, in that it will also get the main event into the ring a little earlier. So maybe you have a chance of getting to bed before midnight.
Well, that'll do it for us. Thank you so much to Eric Raskin and Brian Fonseca for joining me to break down Errol Spence versus Terrence Bud Crawford going down Saturday night at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Both the guys like or lean to Crawford by decision, but they think probably the best angle is to enter on Crawford live after the first couple of rounds. And then in terms of undercard bets, Alejandro Santiago on the money line at plus 130. And then also Isaac Cruz, rounds 1 through 6 knockout at around plus 170. For Brian, for Eric, I'm Sean Zerillo. This has been the Action Network podcast. Best of luck this weekend. We'll see you next time.